This is a workshop on reducing suffering. We have heard a lot about suffering. We have heard a lot about the causes of suffering. We have been given, a solution, but that solution comes in something like, one whole scripture of the Buddha, So, how do we actually tackle this thing, How do we actually reduce our suffering? So, this workshop is about this. Now, the first thing to know is that uh, we recognize that suffering is something that's real, that's happening inside within us, right? And there is a solution, of reducing the suffering or even eliminating this suffering. To be able to do that, we have to understand the realities of our world, So, where does the suffering comes from, Is the suffering in the world in itself, or the suffering in us? Is the cause of suffering outside in the world, or the cause of suffering within us, The first thing we have to understand is that if it is something that's outside in the world, it's a bit difficult for us to grab hold of it and then to change it. But if it is something that's within us, then we have that possibility, of doing something about it. Suffering comes in many different ways, and suffering has many different levels, and there are causes, and we know the causes of suffering because Buddha has given us the way to discover these causes of suffering. Now, the first most important step is to understand about the world. You see, uh, we have to understand clearly what the world is. We have to understand clearly what we mean by the world. There is no question that there is this physical world that is outside our body, that's external to our body. We can sense it through our five senses. We can find the solidity that is inside this out, that is outside of us, that is in the world, that's outside us. Right? And we can see the images, the colors, that is in this external world. Uh, then there is also, you can see the smell, the scent, that we can detect. So with these five senses that we have, we can take in the data of this external world. It is only data that we can take it through these five senses. And these data that we take in are very basic, It's just sound or just scent or just images, just colors, if you like, there's a taste in it as well, and then there is this sensation of liquidity or sensation of hardness or temperature, hot or cold. These are all basic, right? And then what happened is that our mind try to make sense from this data that we collected from the world. In making sense, our mind starts making up. With this information, we start make up. And what we have made up are called mental identities. Something that we can identify with something that is external to us. What we have obtained from the world, this data are very basic, like I've said, colors, shapes, sound, scent, and so on. So our mind try to make up something so that we can identify with what we have seen, what we have heard, what we have smelled, right? So our mind creates this mental identity, and this mental identity lives within us. We use them to identify things in the world. So we can put a label to it, so we can know more about it. Now, when I say know more about it, I'm talking about knowing more about the mental identities that we have created. All these mental identities are just formed from data that we receive from the world. They are just very simplistic data. We got to make sense out of it. We got to put in attributes. And the first thing is whether it is dangerous or not, whether it's pleasurable or painful when we come into contact with it, and so on. So we build these mental identities. Right? And these mental identities are all we know about the world because we build it within ourselves for our own use. And what is happening, which not many people know, is that once we have formed this mental identity, we then project it out onto the world. Right? So what we see are just our own mental identities. Because as we see something, the first thing that we want to do is to identify. Once we have identified, we stop that process. We project our mental identity onto whatever it is that's outside in the world, external to us, whether it is an animal, whether it is a human being, or whether it is a thing. We have a mental identity of it. We have a label for it, right? And you must always remember that what you know is not of the thing that is out there, what you have created through all the information that you have collected from all the different sources. So that's the extent of your knowledge of the external world. That is the extent of the knowledge of other people. Something you create That's the extent of the knowledge of your own self. Something, you build it up. So you can see that everything that we know about the world, about people, about ourselves are something that we have created. Firstly, we do not create things wisely. Second thing is these are the only available information that we can get through our senses. And that is dependent on the condition we are in, the situation we are in, our tendencies. So these mental identities or this world that we come to know, this condition is relative, is dependent on our conditioning. Our conditioning means the family we are born in, the education that we have, the culture we are in, culture we live in. So these mental identities of the world, you can see, is rather suspicious. It depends on how we build it. So you can see that everybody sees things differently depending on how they create it. You can go on to say that everybody creates and live in their own world, their own inner world. We all share the same physical world, but we only see the physical world through our own inner world of mental identity. So whether we create a beautiful world, an ugly world, a safe world, a dangerous world, it all depends on us, on our conditioning, on the information that is accessible to us. One good thing, one good news is that because we create it, we can change and destroy it. That's the good news. We can change what we don't like about the world within us. We don't go out into the world to change the world. We change the mental identity that is within us of how we perceive things in the world, how we perceive, label, and make the mental identities of things in the world, of other people, of us, of ourselves. These mental identities and things that we have created within us, we can change them. We must learn how to deal with them. So suffering has two causes. Holding on to a craving and holding on to views. So you can see that there is this flow chart that we have shown here. that the first thing that we have to do is identify the two causes of suffering. When we have this suffering, then we want to know whether it is craving or evil. Right. Craving is desiring for something, wanting something. And the opposite of craving is aversion, that is not wanting something, right? Running away from something. And views, there are two forms. One is about people, view about ourselves, view about others, and also view of things. And the other is the view on things, the way things should go, the way events should go. See? So we can divide the causes into either craving or views. When we crave, it is usually for something. I'm going to talk about views first. Because of our conditioning, we hold on to views, how things should be, how we want our life to be, how we want our friends to behave, how we want our children to behave, how we want our teachers to behave, our students to behave, and so on. All these views, how we expect strangers to behave, all these are views, right? So we do not want to hold on to these views tightly, saying this is the way things should be. Because the way that things turn out, events turn out, depend on causes within the world itself. It has nothing to do with our views. Our views are separate, that lives within us, something that we create, something you can say fictitious, something we come up with. But the way things or events go in the world depend on causes. So these two things are separate. They have separate causes, right? One, events in the world due to real causes. Views are just dependent on maybe our mood, our conditioning. That's all. Nothing to do with things in the world. So the first thing to come to know is that this view of ours are unreliable. We don't know where they come from. We don't really know unless we investigate. Where this view that I'm holding on to, when did I hold this view? Who influenced me? Where did I get this information to come to this view? And so on, right? So that's investigating deeply into the views. But we don't have to do that. We have to know that these views are unreliable. And we say not sure to it. And what does not sure mean? Not sure means it is empty of what's right and what's wrong. It is empty of what's good and what's bad. It is empty of what's beautiful and what's ugly. It is uncertain. That's what not sure means. There is an absence of right or wrong because these are just views, right? It is absence of any essence at all because it is something that we form from our conditioning. So this not sure will put a stop on our holding on to views, right? Because we can't hold on to something which is not sure. There's nothing to hold on to. For us to hold on to something, it must have at least some essence. So when we apply this not sure to the views that we have, right, then we can remove ourselves from holding firmly onto it. So that's the first causes, views. View of ourselves, view of others, view on things, whether they're good or bad, and views on the way things should go. The second cause of suffering is craving. We crave for something, or we are adverse to something. And what is this something that we crave for? What is this something that we are adverse to? And they are just mental identities. Like I said before, everything in the world that we know is constructed by our mind. This mental identity is constructed by our mind, right? So in that construction of the mental identity, we have put in our feelings of like or dislike, right? So as soon as we identify something or some person which is from our mental identity, this feeling automatically arises because we are built into the mental identities, the feeling we have for this something. Right? And feeling is the cause of craving. Dependent on feeling, craving arises. Depending on feeling, aversion arises. This is part of dependent origination that is taught by the Buddha, right? So feelings comes from the mental identities that we are in contact with. So every time when there is craving or aversion, you want to investigate, how do I create this mental identity that it become something that I crave for, or become something that I'm adverse to. What is it that I have put in this mental identity that makes it so attractive, right? Now that we know these mental identities are constructed, we want to say not sure to the mental identities when we are attracted to it or when we are adverse to it. So the thing we are in contact with has this element of not sure, which means it is empty of good and bad, empty of what's right and wrong, empty of what's ugly and what's beautiful. And it is uncertain. Now, when we do that, then our mind cannot or can no longer hold on to it because it is empty, empty of any essence at all, and it is uncertain. Okay, so that's the theory. Now we are going to do a workshop, right? We're going to use this to actually reduce suffering, real suffering that's in us. Okay?